Hello everybody, welcome. Whether you are a Year 11 student looking at this video for the purposes of induction, joining the sixth form in the future, or a Year 12 student who has been asked to look at this again for the purposes of revision, a central question of importance for your A-level studies is, what is a tragedy and what is a tragic hero? This particular video seeks to take you through that and give you an introduction to those two questions. What is a tragedy? What is a tragic hero? Let's use technology to make this a visual delight. Slideshow is go. How exciting. So, that's what a tragedy is, a drama where the central character suffers disaster or great misfortune. And there's something you can look at should you want to. Why is it included there? Well, I'm not a snob about where you get your resources from. Your teachers don't mind so long as you know your stuff. So whether it's shmup, what a ridiculous thing, but shmup, Spark Notes, York Notes, JSTOR, the library. We live in a world where information is everywhere, but your job is to get your information from trustworthy places which give you reliable information. And most of these revision materials that are produced online are pretty good. So use them. So anyway, moving on. More specifically, a tragedy is a drama, as it says there, where a character, usually somebody of noble or high rank, so a king, a queen, less commonly a queen, but usually a male figure of nobility, falls. They fall. Maybe they die, but they typically fall as a consequence of their confrontation with a superior force. Now, as you can see, it says there in the brackets, fortune, maybe they get some bad luck, the gods, fate perhaps, we see that in Romeo and Juliet, social forces, universal values, maybe they sort of defy cultural norms, they don't do what's expected of them. However, in a tragedy, we usually see how the central figure, the protagonist, as it says there, comes to understand the meaning of his or her deeds, and they accept their punishment. There you are. Usually, or certainly if we look at tragedy in its traditional form, the tragic hero is a man of noble stature. So, as it says there, high position, got the answers. I will say though there that you've got king, duke, prince, company owner, which is a rather different sort of phrase, isn't it? And so what we're doing there is we're moving from the traditional into the slightly more modern when we see that. He's not an ordinary man, but a man with outstanding quality and greatness about him. So in our Shakespearean tragedies, we will see a kingly figure who falls as a consequence of their fatal flaw or their superior force. But in a modern tragedy, such as the ones you're going to be looking at, like The Great Gatsby, specifically by F. Scott Fitzgerald, we will see how Gatsby is not quite an ordinary man in many, many ways. He is ordinary in some ways, which we eventually learn about as we read through the course of the text. But certainly from the perspective of the narrator, there is an outstanding quality of greatness about him. One of the things that we discuss when we look at this text is, well, what is that quality of greatness that marks him out from the rest? And is that thing which marks him out from the rest, is it actually great? Is that something that's open to debate? A key point for most of these characters is that they have to have some admirable quality that makes them good, but we can't have them be so good that they're not relatable. what an awful word that is, relatable, but we have to believe in them. They have to be credible. And so if a character is too grand, too perfect, too imperfectly perfect, then we're less likely to empathize. And therefore, if the purpose of a tragedy, excuse me, is to teach us a message or a moral about something in some way, shape, or form, well, then we're not going to take the message away. So if we relate this to Romeo and Juliet, which many of you will have been studying or studied, while students typically are scornful of Romeo and his immature attitudes to love, sex, and the world around him, it's not beyond the realms of one's imagination to think that there are people who are like Romeo existing to this day. Young boys who fall in love with different people quite quickly. Is that a shocking idea? Absolutely not. Is what happens to them at the end of the text something of a shock? I think so. I think it's supposed to be, otherwise what's the point of it? Shakespeare uses that to sort of convey the dangers of excessive passion. But if Romeo were too perfect, then we wouldn't really care either way. Some of you might be thinking to yourself, well, I didn't care, never liked him anyway. But still, you know. Typically, the tragic hero is destroyed, a rather strong word, but they die or they fall, because they don't necessarily always die, but they fall for some grander point, as I've just said. Usually, it's as a consequence of their own choices. So you will see with Gatsby, he makes choices and he believes in things that he could avoid. You will see with Richard II, he makes choices, he acts in a way that is grand and pompous, and his self-belief means that others don't care for him hugely. They don't care for the way he is, the way that he acts. But in both cases, you won't necessarily think that they deserve the fate that befalls them. And the same applies to Othello, who we typically study in year 13. Rather an impressive character at the beginning of the text, with some significant flaws in terms of the way he sees the world. He makes some bad choices. He's manipulated to make those bad choices, but they are his choices all the same. Even so, we will empathize with each of these characters to a larger or lesser extent, because it won't necessarily be all their fault. It's a waste of life. Of course, we could say that all life is a waste of life. If it's a death that's considered, too early, if a life hasn't been lived. But in the case of a king, it's a waste of the potential of a future king. In the case of a character like Othello, we will see how death is the waste of a once great man who represents both the ability to act as a fearsome warrior on a battlefield, which we don't see too much of course, but also a rather learned man, an educated man, a person who has assimilated into a culture completely different to his own and sort of superseded it. He's gone beyond it as well. With Gatsby, his capacity to dream is what's is arguably his great feature. It gets him to where he is, but it's also his flaw in many respects, and we can see the waste of his life by the end of the text. So we have to remember that any kind of tragedy is judged against the characteristics of a tragedy as defined by Aristotle. So all tragedies that you might see in 2020 are inevitably judged against the characteristics from thousands and thousands of years ago. The characteristics of a tragic hero, as it says there, usually of noble birth, though not always, in more recent times, or more recent plays, we will not see that. There's typically a tragic flaw that leads to their downfall. There's a reversal of fortune, a moment when things change. Their actions result in increased self-awareness and knowledge. Sometimes more modern plays don't necessarily always have that, and we usually feel some semblance of pity and fear for them. And so, as again, to a larger or lesser extent, we will see how, with regards to Othello, Richard II, and Gatsby, J. Gatsby, that these characteristics do apply. Gone too far. Aristotle said, a man cannot become a hero until he can see the root of his own downfall. I'm not going to worry too much about the rest of that. You can read that in your own time. But that arguably is the kind of key defining feature. Otherwise, it's just about a story. You know, these are plays and stories about people who make mistakes and die. Does that make one a tragic hero? Of course not. Plenty of people are going to make mistakes. We all eventually pass away. But it's that idea that there's greatness at the beginning with a fall towards the middle of the text. But the key moment is when they see the error of their ways. They often can't do very much about it, but they see the error of their ways and they have their moment of enlightenment. Many of you will have seen this before, the traditional tragic plot. The thing always to remember about what this is, Freytag's pyramid, Freytag, is that Freytag was from the 19th century. It was written, as you can see on the screen, in 1863. And therefore, because it's from 1863, Shakespeare did not follow Freytag's pyramid. How could he have done? Shakespeare was writing in the 1580s and 90s and early 1600s. He predates Freytag by 250 years. So Shakespeare did not follow Freytag's pyramid, as teachers have been wont to see for a number of years. Freytag has applied a structure to many of Shakespeare's works, where we have Act 1, which sets the scene, Act 2, which provides information, builds on plot, has things happen. Act 3 is where we have a turning point, sometimes referred to as a climactic moment or the climax, and sometimes that's where we see the reversal of fortunes, where things start to go wrong. Act 4 is where we have the events which lead ultimately to the catastrophe and resolution. The thing to always remember about Act 5 is that if it's a tragedy, it's typically catastrophe. Cata, C-A-T-A, in Latin means death. And so Act 5 of tragedies typically ends in a kind of death. If ever you see somebody refer to the ending of a Shakespearean text as the denouement, well, denouement literally, I think, translates as the tying up of a knot. And with it, it brings the notion of the tying up of loose ends. And so we tend to see the denouement of a text in comedies, where in Shakespearean plays at least, this is typically, though not always, resolved in the form of a wedding. And the wedding ties up all the loose ends and all the difficulties that the play has seen in terms of characters not getting on, nasty, aggressive actions between each other. The wedding tends to bring it all back together. So we will see the Shakespearean tragic plot in Othello and in Richard II to a degree, because we have to remember it's just a structure that somebody 250 years later has come along and seen and applied it to all of Shakespeare's many plays. So if he writes over 50 plays, then we might expect to see that some of them will follow this structure, but some of them might not, or some of them will in part and then veer off in other places. I'll leave you to have a read of that one. And hopefully, as a consequence of reading it, you will note that Shakespeare, he didn't write his own stuff. He's borrowing stories from thousands of years ago and updating them and making them relevant for his audience. It's clever, really, isn't it, to think that a man who, well, is using the ideas of others and turning it into something that works for his audience, for his contemporary audience. It's what we see happening today with movies, films. Movies and films are the same thing, of course, but television, whether it's novels, anything else. Ideas are ideas. They're not going to change hugely, are they? The idea that men and women are ambitious and sometimes act on that ambition, as we see in Macbeth, it's not going to disappear. The idea that young people fall in love and their families maybe are not keen on that young love, it's not going to go away. It's not a new idea. And I suspect in another couple of thousand years, we might see these things continuing with other people reinventing them for their audiences. I suspect we won't see them, but it won't be a surprise to imagine that happens, of course. So I'm going to skip some of these pages because they're not hugely relevant to what you're going to study, but because you have studied them in the most part, they provide a little bit of context. Have a quick read. And we don't see this hugely in the texts that we're going to look at. We don't see all of them anyway. Arguably, Othello can be considered to be a character who goes insane, although he is manipulated to lose any sense of rationalism by Act 4 of the play. Move on. Now, as I was alluding to earlier, we will see that we wouldn't expect a modern play, a modern piece of fiction to follow the same arc and the same pattern of tragedy as Shakespeare, or even the ancient Greeks, such as illustrated by Aristotle. Gatsby will conform to this modern tragic hero in so much as he is an ordinary person. He's not born into nobility, he's not a king, he's not a duke. He becomes a very, very wealthy man through not always legal means, or nearly always illegal means, let's be honest. Gatsby does not really have an epiphany. He does not have a moment of awakening, a moment of realization. So the question is, can a figure who does not conform to those strictures, who conform to a person who does not conform to the rules, can they be a tragic hero? Yes or no? That's often one of the questions that you'll be asked to consider in your lessons. As you read the texts. So the purpose of this video has very much been to just briefly as possible, introduce you to the key ideas of one part of the course, which is, let's go back here, tragedy. There are three texts you're going to study. Hopefully that's become clear because I keep name dropping them, but they are Richard II by William Shakespeare, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Othello by William Shakespeare. It's usually the case that we study the first two of those, Richard II and The Great Gatsby, in year 12 before then studying Othello in year 13. But what we would ask you do over the course of your summer holidays is make sure that you buy all 3 texts and read them. Because the number one key to doing really, really well at A-level in English is knowing your text. If you know the text, there's really very little to fear. So hopefully you found that reasonably useful in terms of illustrating some key ideas of what tragedy is, and it gives you a little nudge in the right direction as to one of the things we'd like you to do. Read the texts, enjoy the texts, know the texts, then there's very little to fear. And that's it for this particular video. So hope that was useful. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.